Jerry Seinfeld has a classic joke where he talks about how walking the dog has to be the lowest form of human existence. He says that if aliens were watching this through telescopes and they saw two life forms, one making a poop and the other one picking it up and carrying it around in a bag, who would they assume is in charge? Like a lot of great comedy, it's silly and funny, but I think it might also be getting at something deeper under the surface. On the one hand, it's sort of a silly poop joke, but on the other hand, even if only for a split second, it's challenging assumptions and it's making you think a little bit differently about the way you view everyday routines. It's making you think about what's normal behavior and how would someone outside of my bubble perceive this if they weren't part of my community or my tribe or whatever I define as normal. I think that good history, much like good comedy, should be challenging assumptions. It should be challenging authority structures and historical narratives and the institutions that everybody takes for granted. Otherwise, there would be no room for diversity of thought or investigation or change and improvement. Whoever wrote the first history book would be determining how we remember history forever, which seems kind of silly to me. At any rate, in the last episode, we took this Seinfeldian logic and applied it to historical narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves about the past. And we talked about how at times these tales can be comforting, but not always 100% accurate, and oftentimes even misleading. We looked at what was called the civilizational narrative, which is this foundational historical narrative that says that humans, early humans, were on a track of progression, going from barbaric, primitive hunters and gatherers, learning how to farm, and then suddenly enjoying the fruits of quote-unquote civilization with governments and states and jobs and religions and languages and writing. And it all happened because of this magical moment where humans figured out how to farm. The Neolithic Revolution, it's often called. While this narrative is taught in virtually all school systems around the world, historian and political scientist James C. Scott thinks that it's probably misleading at best and at worst not accurate at all. Scott claims that instead of looking at this Neolithic revolution where humans learned how to farm, instead of looking at it as this magical moment that popped up out of nowhere and suddenly led to all of the great things that we enjoy, like civilization and progress, it actually makes more sense to look at a broader continuum of human beings altering, shaping, and changing the environment that they live in order to suit their needs. It turns out that agriculture and farming might just be one of many ways that early humans adjusted and shaped their environment in order to better survive. And it turns out the things that came later that we associate with the Neolithic Revolution and with farming and agriculture, those things that we associate with progress and civilization, those might not have been a direct result of agriculture and farming, but rather a result of something else, or many other factors. Scott thinks it makes more sense to look at how did we as humans change the environment? In what ways did we do it? Why did we do it? Why did those processes change over time? How did we as humans begin to start changing the environment around us? How did that impact the environment around us? But maybe more importantly, how did us sort of landscaping the environment and changing it to suit our needs change us as a species. In the opinion of James Scott, once you start asking these questions and getting the answers to them, you might become something like the aliens from the Seinfeld joke, where you begin to question the standard narrative and wonder who or what is really in charge. People have argued for a long time about what exactly it is that makes human beings distinct. Some have argued that there's some sort of human nature that other creatures, other animals don't seem to have that gives us sort of a leg up and makes us special in a way. Maybe, but one of the things that, in my opinion, separates us is our ability to change the environment around us, adapt and make changes to our world in ways that other species can't do on a scale that other species can't keep up with. Obviously, this has both positive and negative consequences, and investigating the ways in which humans alter the environment, change the environment, and in turn, the way the environment alters and changes humans is an interesting topic. Probably the first and maybe the classic example of humans using, changing, altering the environment is the use of fire. There's evidence that hominids were using fire at least 400,000 years ago, a long time. And fire was useful for early hominids, early humans, for a variety of reasons, but often for reasons that you wouldn't suspect at first. I think often we think of fire, we think of sort of a campfire with people sitting around the fire, staying warm, using it to cook food. But maybe that wasn't the earliest and most useful form of using fire for early humans. James C. Scott says, quote, "Our ancestors could not have failed to notice how natural wildfires transformed the landscape, how they cleared old vegetation and encouraged a host of quick colonizing grasses and shrubs, many bearing desired seeds, berries, fruits, and nuts. They could also not have failed to notice that a fire drove fleeing game from its path, exposed hidden burrows and nests of small game, and most important, later stimulated the browse and mushrooms that attracted grazing prey. Native North Americans deployed fire to sculpt landscapes favored by elk, deer, beaver, hare, porcupine, ruffed grouse, turkey, and quail, all of which they hunted. The game they subsequently bagged represented a kind of harvesting of prey animals they had deliberately assembled by carefully creating a habitat they would find enticing. Quite apart from being the designers of hunting grounds, veritable game parks, early humans used fire to hunt large game. The evidence suggests that long before the bow and arrow appeared, roughly 20,000 years ago, hominids were using fire to drive herd animals off precipices and to drive elephants into bogs where, immobilized, they could be more easily killed." End quote. This is maybe the first example of early humans altering the environment, and you can see that obviously it would be useful for hunting and gathering. Driving prey, game into the right place, using fire as a way to lure different creatures in, and using it as a way to facilitate the growth of useful crops. James C. Scott calls this process of humans altering the environment to benefit them niche construction. A niche is typically seen as a place that you create that is beneficial to you. It's also, of course, worth mentioning the other ways that fire was important for early humanity, whether it was safety, whether it was light, whether it was warmth, whether it was cooking. Obviously, fire was a huge tool for cooking, which opened up a whole new slew of foods that could now be eaten. Some have argued that this allows for less calories to be spent on sort of the hunting and gathering because you can now cook and eat food in that way, and that therefore evolution could now put those extra calories to use in other ways, perhaps brain development and things like that. But as James C. Scott often does, if you're going to look at the way that humans interacted and changed the environment, in this case with fire, you also have to look at the ways in which the use of this fire changed humans. So Scott argues that this opens up a whole new diet for humans, which changes things tremendously, as we talked about. It also encourages humans to live in more settled areas, population concentration, because now all of a sudden different foods that previously couldn't be eaten were now on the menu, and this meant that perhaps the distances you had to travel and the lengths you had to go to eat became shorter, and fire simply allows you to live in places that you otherwise couldn't live if you're using it for warmth, hunting, and cooking. So Scott is pointing out that we have this way in which early humans are domesticating fire, but in some sense, fire is domesticating early humans. He says, quote, "We have adapted our habits, diet, and body to the characteristics of fire, and having done so, we are chained, as it were, to its care and feeding. If the litmus test of domestication for a plant or animal is that it cannot propagate itself without our assistance, then by the same token, we have adapted so massively to fire that our species would have no future without it. Even overlooking entirely the fire-dependent crafts that developed later, potter, blacksmith, baker, brickmaker, glassmaker, metalworker, gold and silversmith, brewer, charcoal maker, food smoker, plaster maker, it is no exaggeration to say that we are utterly dependent on fire. It has, in a real sense, domesticated us." End quote. So Scott sees fire as an example of what he calls niche construction, where humans are altering the landscape and using the environment to benefit them. And according to the standard civilizational narrative, fire is just one of these technologies that ultimately humans begin using until eventually humans begin to farm on a large scale. And what the civilizational narrative teaches is that oftentimes what allows this large-scale agriculture to start happening is irrigation, finding ways to divert rivers and create channels, so to speak, in a way that can help water large stretches of farmland. The civilizational narrative looks at Mesopotamia, which is the area between the Tigris and Euphrates River, where what we think of as civilization began. And the narrative basically says, hey, go look at some pictures of that area, go look at some videos of that area. It's a desert, but you have these two rivers. So the only thing that makes sense is that human beings used irrigation to make life sustainable there. Scott summarizes this narrative when he says, quote, "Confined in limited oases and river valleys, a growing population was assumed to have been obliged to intensify its subsistence practices in order to extract more from limited arable land. The only viable intensification strategy was irrigation, for which there was archaeological evidence. Irrigation alone could guarantee the abundant harvests where rainfall was so woefully inadequate. In turn, such a huge project of landscape modification required the mobilization of labor to dig and maintain the canals, which implied the existence of a public authority capable of assembling and disciplining that labor force. Irrigation works made for a dense agro-pastoral economy that they assumed fostered state formation as a condition of its existence." End quote. Scott is basically using some complicated historian speak there for saying the Middle East is a desert now, so back then human beings began farming, and the way they did it was they used irrigation. And because they needed labor and specialization of resources to continue farming and surviving, states began to pop up, governments began to pop up to organize that labor. The problem with this narrative is that while it seems to make sense logically, when you look at the evidence, it doesn't actually add up. First of all, it's ignoring a very key fact about the environment on Earth and the way it interacts with human beings, and that fact is that the environment changes for a variety of reasons. So just because Mesopotamia today, when we look at pictures and videos coming from Iraq, is what we would probably call some sort of desert, or at least that's what it seems like when we look at those news reports, that's not the way it was 10,000 years ago. In fact, evidence shows that it was not particularly arid at all. It was actually more of a wetland. So Scott says that the alluvium was 10 meters below the current level. This meant that it's very likely that as the rivers were waxing and waning, there were annual deposits of water, sediments, etc., that created a rich and diverse wetlands, which would be ideal for early human hunting and gathering style of survival. And when I say hunting and gathering style of survival, in some ways that can be misleading because we tend to think of hunters and gatherers, according to the standard narrative, as sort of mindlessly following the packs of elephants or the packs of woolly mammoths or whatever the narrative tells us. But the reality is a lot of times hunters and gatherers stayed relatively sedentary in these sort of settled communities and used the environment to let the food come to them. This strategy makes a lot more sense from a survival perspective because it's easier to do. It takes advantage of the migrations of different animals, whether it be fish or birds that typically do this seasonally. It allows you to use fire in that landscaping capacity where you're sort of burning out areas, funneling animals, funneling game towards you so that you can kill them more easily and use them for food. It allows you to stay in this wetlands area where you can use those annual deposits to farm in a smaller scale and use that to supplement your diet. And all of this together combines to make a stable and sedentary lifestyle with a minimal amount of labor much more feasible. And this is all in the context of that sort of hunting and gathering, pastoral, nomadic, yet somewhat settled existence. James Scott talks about this Mesopotamian wetland thousands of years ago that would have been ideal for this style of life. Quote, "The combination of rich alluvial soils with an estuary of two great rivers teeming with nutrients, dead and alive, made for an exceptionally rich life that in turn attracted huge numbers of fish, turtles, birds, and mammals, not to mention humans, preying on creatures lower on the food chain. In the warm, wet conditions that prevailed in the 7th and 6th millennial BCE, wild subsistence resources were diverse, abundant, stable, and resilient, virtually ideal for a hunter-gatherer pastoralist. The density and diversity of resources that are lower in the food chain in particular make sedentism more feasible. Compared, say, with hunter-gatherers who may follow large game, seals, bison, caribou, those who take most of their diet from lower trophic levels, such as plants, shellfish, fruits, nuts, and small fish that are, other things equal, denser and less mobile than the larger mammals and fish, can be far less migratory. The cornucopia of subsistence resources from lower trophic levels in the wetlands of Mesopotamia was perhaps uniquely favorable to the early creation of substantial sedentary communities." End quote. Locating yourself in these wetland areas the way that early humans did also allows for transportation and trade to be much easier because there's much less friction in these wetland areas and along these rivers. Trading and moving from place to place up and down these rivers becomes a lot easier, encouraging people to stay in place. You might be asking yourself, what's the point? Who cares at this point? I think that Scott's point here is that human beings became, in many ways, settled, sedentary, staying in one place long before we had this large-scale farming, agriculture, Neolithic revolution. Human beings, thousands of years before what we would think of as big civilizational states and governments, were living relatively sedentary, settled lifestyles in these wetland areas. Turns out that, like today, human beings were opportunistic generalists. They could move from niche to niche depending on what suited them at the time. If that meant doing a little bit of farming, if that meant taking advantage of the annual deposits from the local rivers, if that meant trading up and down a close-by river, if that meant switching over to hunting and gathering for a time, if that meant some combination of all of these things, then human beings were able to switch, adapt, change, and sort of combine all of these different ways of living. This was all based on the needs of the early humans and maybe even the preferences and the differences between different areas of the world and different mini cultures within those communities. This is important because this hodgepodge idea of humans using the environment around them to best suit their needs actually flies in the face of the civilizational narrative, which says that there was a very strict and clear progression from making fire to using technology to hunting and gathering to figuring out how to farm, and then magically human beings started living in settled societies, and that's when towns and cities started sprouting up, and we get civilization from there. Again, the reality is that, according to Scott at least, these towns, these local settlements were popping up well before the Neolithic Revolution. So it seems like it wasn't just farming, just agriculture that led to the development of states and governments. Maybe it was something else. Again, rather than looking at the development of agriculture and farming as this progression from primitive, uncivilized, barbaric hunting and gathering to civilized and sophisticated farmers, the evidence, according to Scott, seems to say that the better explanation is that early humans lived in these rich, diverse wetlands where diverse and numerous options for subsistence were always on the table, whether it was fish, whether it was small mammals, whether it was trade, or whether it was taking advantage of flood agriculture as a system of irrigation in some sense, taking advantage of the rivers and the deposits of silt and other nutrients in the soil. And this all fits with this idea of early humans using every tool in the toolbox, so to speak, in order to survive, whatever was available. James C. Scott says, quote, "Whether we wish to call it niche construction, domestication of the environment, landscape modification, or the human management of ecosystems, it is clear on a long view that much of the world was shaped by human activity well before the first societies based on fully domesticated wheat, barley, goats, and sheep appear in Mesopotamia. This is why, finally, the conventional subspecies of subsistence modes, hunting, foraging, pastoralism, and farming, make so little historical sense. The same people have practiced all four, sometimes in a single lifetime. The activities can and have been combined for thousands of years, and each of them bleeds imperceptibly into the next along a vast continuum of human rearrangements of the natural world." End quote. More fancy historical speak there, but what he's saying is what we've sort of been talking about during this episode. There's this broad continuum of human beings altering the environment. Many people think that begins with fire, as we talked about, but it slowly moves into other areas, including using technology, using irrigation and river floods, taking advantage of the abundance of different diverse species in these wetland areas to survive. And the reality is that people moved from all sorts of different ways of living, and they might have practiced all of these different ways of living at the same time. So rather than sort of this big single watershed, pun intended, moment where humans figure out how to farm and then the rest is history, the evidence seems to show that there was thousands of years where humans were sort of combining all of these tools in the toolbox and using them as best they could. All that being said, a big question still remains. And that question is, why did human beings turn primarily to agriculture and primarily to farming? Because that's ultimately what ends up happening in many of these river valleys, where you get these states, these governments, these city-states developing, and then those expand into these, what many would call civilizations. And they're all based on farming grains, farming them, storing them, taxing them, feeding the population. This was the basis of what many people think are these early civilizations. So if it wasn't this magical progression that was happening, but rather a mixed continuum, what made people in these areas decide to start doing this farming thing as the primary way of living? James C. Scott admits that he's not quite sure. He has some theories, which we'll get into. One theory he offers gives a combination approach of sorts where you had a number of factors involved, where you had overpopulation, lots of people moving into these rich, diverse wetlands, which created more competition for resources. You had declines in big game, declines in being able to hunt and gather due to overhunting. Perhaps you had climate change as these wetlands transitioned over thousands of years into more dry areas, and perhaps farming on a large scale became more necessary. So Scott is not exactly sure as to that question, and we'll get into more of the theories that go along with that in the next couple of episodes. But one thing Scott is sure about is that this domestication of plants and domestication of animals is something that happens over the course of human history, and it's something that not only impacts the environment, but it also impacts, in turn, the humans who are affecting the environment. Scott calls this system of domestication and the way humans lived in combination with domesticated plants and animals in these settled communities, Scott calls this the Domus Complex. Scott says, quote, "Whatever the reasons for the growing reliance on domesticated grains and animals for subsistence, it represents a qualitative change in landscape modification. The cultivars were transformed, the livestock was transformed, the soils and fodder they depended on were transformed, and, not least, Homo sapiens were transformed. Here the term domestication, from domus or household, needs to be taken rather literally. The domus was a unique and unprecedented concentration of tilled fields, seed and grain stores, people, and domestic animals, all co-evolving with consequences no one could have possibly foreseen." End quote. According to Scott, the best way to look at this is as a mutual dependency and coevolution of everything that goes along with the domus, the settled community, the household. That includes plants, that includes the humans that are living there, that includes the environment around the humans that are living in these domus complexes. That includes domesticated animals like dogs and cats. That includes the microorganisms that are being attracted to these settled communities and are spreading unforeseen results, which we'll get into. Take plants, for example, and the evolution of domesticated plants like grains and wheat and barley. Not all of these plants have natural selection goals that match the goals of the farmer. So the farmer's goal is to isolate as many variables as possible for these domesticated plants to be productive. But by isolating those variables and changing the plant, including in ways that the plant normally relies on to survive on its own, a domesticated plant can no longer survive on its own. It can only survive with human nurturing and dependence. The same logic applies to domesticated animals, which is obviously a huge part of the human ability to live in settled communities. Some of this is human-directed evolution, some is unintended consequences, and some is just the built-in nature of animals, but animals like goat and sheep tend to exhibit certain characteristics after being domesticated. These include emotional numbness. Some evidence exists for smaller brains, a limbic system that is greatly affected, less emotion, less aggression, less fight or flight instinct, less reaction to external stimuli. Some evidence exists suggesting that domesticated animals are more susceptible to disease because of crowded conditions and less variable genetics due to breeding. The idea for Scott is that as human beings are bringing animals, plants, and other elements into this Domus Complex, into this settled community, they are changing unintentionally over time, over the course of thousands of years. They're changing those animals, they're changing those plants, for good or for ill. There's a coevolution that's going on. Scott then takes that logic and begins to speculate on potential human parallels. So is it possible that human beings have been changed by living in this Domus Complex, by living in these settled societies? Is there differences between the humans who evolved in those scenarios versus what we would term quote-unquote barbarians who were not living in this settled complex? Could there be unintended consequences of domesticating animals, domesticating plants that would apply to us, whether that be physically, emotionally, psychologically, so on and so forth? Scott says, quote, "This path of inquiry is as speculative as it is intriguing, but it is, I believe, fruitful precisely because it entertains the idea that we are as much a product of self-domestication in both intended and unintended ways as other species of the Domus are products of our domestication." End quote. I think he uses the term speculation here because it's very difficult to analyze this, particularly from a physical perspective, just on the nature of the fact that it's so difficult and it happened so long ago, and it's difficult to examine genetic and physical changes and these types of things happening over time, especially with the technology we have now. But that being said, our technology could improve, and studying this more in depth could actually be a thing in the future. Scott does offer some evidence that hunting and gathering, more pastoralist, sort of nomadic groups seem to be more physically robust than their sedentary counterparts. But as far as the biological changes, as far as why that might be the case, it's unclear. Scott also questions what types of behavioral changes could have resulted from this domestication complex. Is it possible that the limbic system, the emotions, the aggressions, the fight or flight instincts that were necessary in the hunting and gathering complex were not as necessary in this domesticated complex, and as a result, human beings changed over time? That's a difficult question to answer, but it's worth thinking about. Scott claims that hunting and gathering, this type of lifestyle, would be determined by the tempo and rhythm of nature. It would be more diverse. It would include more activities, a more diverse set of knowledge and tools that you would have to rely on at any time. Again, you might have to move from hunting and gathering to small-scale farming, to fishing, to trading, to doing all sorts of different activities. And humans living this lifestyle would be going by the rhythm of nature, and they would be collecting sort of an encyclopedia of oral and collective memory and knowledge, a diverse skill set of things needed for subsistence. Whereas strictly relying on farming, like a lot of these early states that start popping up around 3000 BC did, living that Domus Complex lifestyle is a tempo based on the life cycle of a single crop, which is grain. Potentially, the entire existence of a community, a settlement, could rely on the sort of clockwork of farming. Life could become a monotonous ritual based entirely on the life cycle of the crops that were being domesticated and planted. If there was a bad harvest or a bad farming season, that could spell doom for an entire settlement. Scott says, quote, "Once cereals became established as a staple in the early Middle East, it is striking how the agricultural calendar came to determine much of public ritual life. Ceremonial plowing by priests and kings, harvest rites and celebrations, prayers and sacrifices for an abundant harvest, gods for particular grains. The metaphors with which people reasoned were increasingly dominated by domesticated grains and domesticated animals. A time to sow and a time to reap, being a good shepherd. There was hardly a passage in the Old Testament that fails to make use of such imagery. This codification of subsistence and ritual life around the Domus was powerful evidence that, with domestication, Homo sapiens had traded a wide spectrum of flora for a handful of cereals and a wide spectrum of wild fauna for a handful of livestock." End quote. So perhaps it's no surprise that early religious ceremonies and rituals were based so much on the harvest, because it seems like early humans had traded a diverse set of skills that could lead to many different ways of subsisting for farming and domesticating animals, which could lead to ruin much more easily, at least according to Scott. Challenging the civilizational narrative once again and the progress and benefits that supposedly resulted from farming, agriculture, and the Neolithic Revolution, Scott concludes one of his chapters by saying, quote, "I am tempted to see the late Neolithic Revolution, for all its contributions to large-scale societies, as something of a de-skilling. Adam Smith's iconic example of the productivity gains achievable through the division of labor was the pin factory, where each minute step of pin making was broken down into a task carried out by a different worker." Alexis de Tocqueville read The Wealth of Nations sympathetically, but asked, "What can be expected of a man who has spent 20 years of his life putting heads on pins?"